And this war that is now being planned will not solve any problems either. It will only create new ones, with entirely different dimensions, going much deeper, traumatizing whole generations, and so on. Germany is the hub of the coming war, and they are even proud of it. I remember very clearly when in 1949 or 1950, we drove to Bremen to visit friends. I walked through streets where there were burned-out houses. I could smell it. I had that smell of fire in my nose, and I only knew that war must be something terribly awful. Are Germans sleepwalking into disaster? No, they are not sleepwalking into disaster. They are in a deep coma.
Against the current, about the person.
Hallo bei Gegen den Strom. Wir präsentieren
Hello and welcome to Against the Current. We present positions and perspectives that the propaganda media keep silent about. After 3 days, he would have been removed from the ration list with his nuclear blocking train. In 1973, Captain Wolfgang Effenberger was responsible in Munich for operational planning in the event of a nuclear emergency, for setting up nuclear traps so that no Warsaw Pact army could have advanced through Germany. Ever since then, he has been preoccupied with the question of why the world cannot find peace. Today he is a publicist and has written many books, including this one, The Black Book of the EU and NATO. Welcome, Wolfgang Effenberger.
EU und NATO. Willkommen, Wolfgang Effenberger.
Yes, thank you very much for making your way here to join us. And of course, I'm looking forward to the interview with you. No question about it. Yambro.
Politicians say we need to become ready for war again. Is that right?
Ist richtig?
That is certainly not right. In view of these two devastating world wars, which left behind so much misery and suffering, I believe there is only one obligation for this country, to become capable of peace. And that is also the mandate enshrined in the Basic Law. So certainly not becoming capable of war. The suffering and destruction that would then be inflicted on this population are unimaginable.
The
only person who recognized this was the writer and theater director Bertolt Brecht in 1951. In the course of rearmament, he wrote a letter to writers, above all, and to artists. He found an interesting comparison, an image that in my view is absolutely valid today. He wrote, Carthage was once a great country. After the First Punic War, it was still powerful. After the Second Punic War, it was still habitable. And after the Third, it could no longer be found. That is the fate Germany faces in a serious conflict. That is exactly what Germany will face.
Warum reden dann unsere Politiker von Kriegstüchtigkeit?
Why then do our politicians talk about being ready for war? What drives them? I don't understand them. I don't understand it. It seems they have completely lost sight of German history from 1914 to at least 1945. And perhaps that's because they were born afterward, too. Personally, I was also born after the war. But when my family was expelled, my mother was 8 months pregnant with me. I grew up in northern Germany, and I remember it clearly. When we went to visit friends in Bremen in 1949 or 1950, I walked through streets with burned-out houses. I could smell it. I had that smell of fire in my nose, and I only knew that war must be something terribly awful. So, growing up with those stories, and then of course in the displaced persons camp too, there were only women, children, and old people, and they were all crying. That has stayed with me. It will stay with me forever. And that's why I believe we have to do everything we can to prevent something like that. And what I know from history is this: wars have never solved problems. Never. And this war that's now being planned won't solve any problems either. It will only create new ones with entirely different dimensions, much deeper ones that will traumatize whole generations, and so on.
Why is the war still being planned? I mean, I don't understand it. I have to say that quite honestly. There is an Operation Plan Germany, and it's secret.
Hast du Kenntnisse, was da drin steht?
Do you know what's in it? No, only a little. Three-star General Bodeman has been dancing around the issue on talk shows like Lanz and so on, acting very mysterious. But at the same time, he's also talking about what the plan is supposed to do. Among other things, the task is for Germany to serve as the host nation. That means Germany is the hub of the coming war. And they're even proud of that, the hub of the coming war.
Die Drehscheibe des kommenden Krieges. Und hier müssen also die Verbündeten.
And so, the Allied troops have to be received from the English Channel or North Sea coast, moved through the country, and then taken all the way to the eastern flank, as it is so euphemistically called. And during this transport, Germany has to cover everything. It has to ensure supplies in every respect, including medical care. And when hundreds of thousands of soldiers arrive, that creates a great deal of work. They have to be fed, and so on and so on. That is one of the tasks. And General Bodeman also says the Bundeswehr's own field kitchens are already at the front. We don't have them anymore.
Die sind schon an der Front. Die haben wir gar nicht mehr.
Das bedeutet beispielsweise,
For example, does that mean that in hospitals, injured civilians, people who have been in accidents, or who have had a stroke, have to step aside and wait when injured soldiers come in?
warten müssen, wenn verletzte Soldaten reinkommen?
Das wird offen gesagt. Also, einmal, dass hier
That is being said openly. For one thing, this is about providing care, and these are still healthy soldiers. As long as they arrive, they are still largely healthy, unless of course there are airstrikes during the advance, and that is to be expected. So even during the advance, when they land at the Channel or on the North Sea, there will already be the first wounded and dead. You could say, whoever is still needed as cannon fodder gets priority. That's how it is, exactly. And Bodeman says that the medical units will also be at the front. Then the Bundeswehr will have nothing left, and it will be passed on to civilian institutions, to the Red Cross, the Johanniters, the Maltese. And I have to say, how naive do you have to be? These young people working in these charitable sectors, many of them also come from abroad.
Das sind ja auch viele, die aus dem Ausland kommen. Die werden sagen, mache ich nicht mit. Also,
They'll say, I'm not going along with this. It's simply too dangerous here for me, and I'm not a soldier either. I'll make sure I leave this country as quickly as possible. And you can only say that if you've never been in a hospital. 2 years ago, I had the good fortune of spending 11 days in the hospital because of something where they didn't know what caused it. But for 11 days, I was able to study our healthcare system, and it was highly revealing. I got along very well with the young people. They always asked me what I wanted, and they all came from Indonesia, Thailand, or somewhere else. Very sweet, nice, intelligent young people in their mid-20s. And I asked them, what will you do if war breaks out now? They looked at me with wide eyes. We'll be going home very quickly.
Der Operationsplan
Operation Plan Germany calls for directing all of the country's resources toward an upcoming war, and everyone is going along with it.
und alle machen mit. Wie erklärst du dir das?
Ich verstehe es nicht. Also,
How do you explain that? I don't understand it. Well, I can explain it. Propaganda. Again, that's a broad field. It could really take up the whole morning. Propaganda these days is incredibly subtle. And that again is part of this form of warfare. Omni-war. First of all, we know cognitive warfare from Togel.
Die kognitive Kriegführung.
Jonas Tögel.
Jonas Togel, a propaganda researcher at the University of Regensburg. An omni-war means that every area of life is drawn into a war.
Omnivore ist ja noch ein Raum. Da ist ja, wir fangen an mit der Transhumanismus.
That goes back over 40 years. I mean, the whole development, transhumanism, and let's say reaching into the human soul, or into the brain, or human-machine interfaces, and things like that. It all originates with the American military. And Admiral Owens was responsible for that 50 years ago, I would say. Willie Wimmer also spoke with him. And Willie Wimmer was told at the Pentagon back then that Willie Wimmer, who was a state secretary in the federal government under Helmut Kohl. Exactly. And from 1993 to 2000, he was also vice president of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly.
1903 bis 2000 der Vizepräsident der OSZE-Vollversammlung.
Die Politik spricht davon.
Politicians are saying that we need to be ready for a war with Russia by 2029. That means we have 3 years left. Is that realistic? Where do those 3 years come from?
Wo kommen die 3 Jahre her?
Sie sind natürlich rein fiktiv.
They are, of course, purely fictional. I mean, the 3 years, some people are even talking about 2030. I don't know who came up with those 3 years. But if we think about it, in 1936, the Wehrmacht had only 100,000 men and no conscription. And 3 years later, an army of 2.5 million superbly trained soldiers with a powerful air force the world had never seen before marched in and invaded Poland. So it wasn't just 3 years. It would be possible, certainly, but thank God it isn't possible in today's situation. You won't be able to create that kind of readiness for war, because people have heard a great deal from their grandparents, I would think, about their family histories. There are also many displaced people here who still know that sad family history.
Die diese traurige Familiengeschichte noch kennen. Also, glaube ich schon, aber auf der anderen Seite wird mir
I think so, yes. But on the other hand, I'm being told that especially at high schools, this willingness to go to war is once again finding fertile ground. That young people, young men as well as young women, at 17 or 18, are convinced that they have to defend this democracy against the evil Russian. And this propaganda seems to be finding fertile ground there. Not among many, admittedly, but when a dynamic like that takes hold in a graduating class, when the alpha personalities, let's say, of course, we have to do this, and then say we have to defend this country, this freedom, this democracy, against an authoritarian system.
Gegen ein autoritäres System. Unter so einem wollen wir nicht leben.
We don't want to live under something like that. Now, Putin has repeatedly said that he has absolutely no interest in attacking NATO. So where does this fear of a Russian attack come from?
Die Angst vor einem russischen Angriff, diese Angst haben wir natürlich.
Of course, we have this fear of a Russian attack. It goes back to Goebbels-era propaganda. It goes back that far. And of course, yes, fear of the Russians is at least partly not unfounded. If we think about it, on August 1st, 1914, Rennenkampf's army, the Russian army, was in the east of East Prussia, and Samsonov's army was in the south, already on August 1st. And shortly before that, Wilhelm II had called on the Tsar to withdraw the general mobilization. Otherwise, Germany would also have to mobilize and declare war, which is what happened just a few hours later. And then came this gigantic Battle of Tannenberg.
Und dann kam es ja zu dieser gigantischen Schlacht in Tannenberg. Also, das war da, dieser Krieg
So,
wurde geführt
that was
worden
there.
in den ersten Wochen
This war was
im
fought,
August
even in the first weeks of August
1914.
1914. Of course, you could build on that and say, but back then, this was an attack plan by Russia and France. France had War Plan 17, and while Germany had the well-known Schlieffen Plan, the French had Plan 17 for their army. They wanted to break through in southern Germany, near Strasbourg and Mulhouse, in order to unite with the Russian army in Berlin. But that does not explain why the propaganda is circulating today. No, it does not explain it at all. But it was used.
Überhaupt nicht. Aber man hat es benutzt. Man hat es benutzen können. Man hat ja.
They were able to use it.
Mit der Propaganda.
Well, that's always how propaganda works. The most dangerous propaganda, of course, is when you have a kernel of truth and say, that happened, it can be documented, and so on, even though it was no longer true at all, and still isn't. If we think of the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922 between the Soviet Union at the time and Germany, the German democracy, between Chancellor Wirth and Foreign Minister Rathenau, the point was that these two countries, these pariah countries, were not allowed to be represented or accommodated in Geneva, like the other countries in the League of Nations.
Germany had to pay the reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. It was not integrated into the League of Nations, and the Soviet Union, as a communist country, was a pariah.
And they joined forces, and then they were immediately brought under this treaty, mutual assistance, economic aid, and so on. And that developed into close cooperation, including in the military sphere.
Also der Satz,
So the statement by Germany's current foreign minister, Russia will always be our enemy, is historically correct.
stimmt ja
Das
historisch
ist
gar nicht.
überhaupt nicht. Nein, also 22 schon nicht mehr. Also das waren dann die
Not at all. No.
8 Jahre
Not even by
von
1922.
1914.
Just 8 years after the attack in 1914, none of that was true
Die
anymore.
Sowjetunion vielmehr
The Russians, or rather, the Soviet Union, enabled the Weimar government to circumvent the Treaty of Versailles and train its armored forces in the Soviet Union.
unterlaufen.
So the armored forces and the Air Force were trained in the Soviet Union, which they later went on to
Und die
attack.
Luftwaffe wurde in der Sowjetunion ausgebildet, die sie dann später angegriffen hat.
Und dennoch schreibt der spätere
And yet, the future Führer and Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler wrote in a letter, "We will kick in the door of the Bolsheviks, and then the whole house will collapse." He expressed himself similarly on page 750 of his book, Mein Kampf. Where did this megalomania come from? Did they underestimate their opponent?
Unterschätzte man da den Gegner?
Ja, das ist für mich also überhaupt nicht nachvollziehbar.
That is completely incomprehensible to me. I simply cannot explain the attack on the Soviet Union, even to this day. And that was the case too. Haushofer, the former general, who later became a professor of geography, had connections to the foreign ministry through his son, and he also had the right to speak with Adolf Hitler. He repeatedly warned against attacking the Soviet Union. He said, "It can't be done. We have to live in friendly relations with the Soviet Union." But when you say,
Beziehung zur Sowjetunion lebt.
Aber wenn man sagt, wir haben leichtes Spiel, wir
That is,
die Tür ein,
we'll have an easy time of it. We'll kick the door in, and then it'll work out, then the whole system will collapse. That resembles ideas that exist today.
wir müssen
We have to put pressure on the Russian Federation, and that will bring about Putin's downfall.
einen Sturz von Putin.
Ja, also es ist nicht nachvollziehbar, dieser Angriff 1941.
that attack on the Soviet Union in 1941 is impossible to comprehend. Before that, in August 1939, there was the Hitler-Stalin Pact, a peace agreement that was then broken by Germany. What motivated the German Reich government in 1941 is impossible to comprehend. Is politics today heading into a similar danger again? This time it will be disastrous. It will trigger exactly what Bertolt Brecht predicted. Exactly. And as I said, in 1977, when the issue of rearmament became acute again, I traveled from Moscow to Irkutsk on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Even though, given my highest security clearance, I never should have been allowed to travel. I looked at the infrastructure and found that the infrastructure, the factories and facilities, the rail tracks, and so on, were completely dilapidated.
Anlagen, Gleisanlagen und so weiter total marode ist. Dass also dieses Land 1907 nicht in der Lage war, einen Krieg.
So this country was not in a position to wage a war in 1977, and that's what I then went public with. But this military buildup was intentional. The Soviet Union was completely finished because of this massive arms buildup, and of course also because of what US policy had already been doing, always in the struggle against the Soviet Union. So this country was already completely finished because of this arms buildup. And today? Well, today I think it's different. In 2023, I was back in the Sverdlovsk region, in Yekaterinburg, and I see factory facilities that are completely intact, the most modern imaginable. So it cannot be compared. Russia today has learned, and it cannot be provoked in that way either. They have steadily expanded their defense capabilities and have now reached a point where an American victory is completely out of the question.
Wo ein Sieg der Amerikaner völlig ausgeschlossen ist.
Wie erklärst du dir den
Then how do you explain General Freuding's torchlight speech in Lithuania?
General Freuding
Are people once again under the illusion that they can defeat Russia?
Illusion, man könne Russland besiegen?
Ja, also der General Freuding.
Yes, General Freuding, that's a trigger word for me too. I can't even follow it anymore. I just can't listen to it. I think, what's going on with these people? He was also the coordinator for support to Ukraine. What's happening here? In my view, have they completely lost their sense of reality? Or has their career clouded their judgment, so to speak? I don't know. I just don't understand it.
Ich weiß es nicht. Ich verstehe es einfach nicht.
Möglicherweise macht
Perhaps Operation Plan Germany makes sense less in military terms than in economic ones.
ökonomisch Sinn. Wäre das eine Variante?
Would that be one option? You can't separate these things. What's happening here now, in this preparation for war, in my view, this preparation for war already has or will have consequences quite comparable to the visible consequences of an actual war. Money is being taken away from other areas now. It's perfectly clear. If I want to put together a budget with 5% for the military budget, considering that in 2024, the entire federal budget was 10.9%, then 5% is almost half of that. So now we have to spend half of it on the military. There won't be much left for education and social services.
Well, we have the situation that the sanctions against Russia have turned out to be a boomerang. The German economy cannot operate competitively with these high energy prices resulting from the sanctions, because we need American gas, for example. The German economy is in free fall. Deindustrialization is underway, and jobs are being moved elsewhere. Are they trying to get by with a kind of military Keynesianism?
Yes, perhaps one or two, but it will not solve the problem. It will sustainably destroy the country without any bombs falling here. The level of destruction will be deeply rooted, with all the consequences for people who will completely lose their trust in this state, and of course, in democracy as well. That is a truly fatal development. It opens doors to structures that we certainly do not want. The only thing we have to do is learn from history. We must finally take to heart what is in the Basic Law, what the fathers and mothers of the Basic Law, who experienced both the First and Second World Wars, created from those experiences. We must say we need to become capable of peace. And when I think about it, what really makes me angry is that on December 17th, 2021, 4 weeks before the war began in Ukraine, Putin did what he had always wanted to do. He wrote 2 letters, one to the United States and one to NATO. And in them, he demanded, or rather, he asked, for a gradual, sustainable security arrangement spanning 3 generations. That was his wish. And the points he listed there, I have to say, I could ultimately sign off on every single one of them. There were 8 points, except for the one that got people here so worked up. That was a basis for discussion, a working basis. It was aimed at limiting NATO's development to the year 1997, partly rolling NATO back out of Eastern Europe.
That was the only thing that got the West so worked up. And the NATO Secretary General at the time, Jens Stoltenberg, wrote, "Of course we did not agree to that. That means they wanted the war. And it was already clear to me beforehand that they wanted the war because, well, NATO provoked the war in Ukraine." Am I right about that?
Yes, of course. As I said, we have these papers from TRADOC, the Training and Doctrine Command. The United States created it in 1973. What does it contain? Well, you have to understand, it is simply a command authority. We created a command authority led by a 4-star general, and it instructs the Army, Air Force, Navy, Cyber Command, and all commands on what they are supposed to prepare for. So it's a very important command authority. It produces many papers, and this command was created in 1973 out of necessity, because in light of the lost Vietnam War, it was clear to them that there would be turmoil in the United States. There had already been demonstrations against the Vietnam War, and so on and so forth. So, given the situation in the country and in the world, they needed something to prepare for a decline. And that's why there was this Training and Doctrine Command, which really developed doctrines for how to continue operating successfully around the world. What does that involve? It was a command area that was created and tasked with getting the army back into shape. In 1973, after the Vietnam War, it was in a terrible state. The goal was to make it a fully operational army again, and to ensure that the public supported the United States having a powerful military that could act around the world. And of course, they produced a number of papers, they restructured and reworked the army, and so on. This command essentially took over the thinking behind building a powerful army that also had support at home.
How should that be achieved?
Das sollte erreicht werden, ja, durch
That was supposed to be achieved, yes, through appropriate political measures as well, of course. The necessity of the wars had to be demonstrated, that the United States shows its flag around the world and so on. Typical American behavior, saying, okay, we are the police of this world, we are necessary, and so on. So everything that could be prepared politically and propagandistically. And the goal was, after all, the Soviet Union was the opponent. The Soviet Union had to be broken up. At the time, we still had bipolarity, meaning America and the Soviet Union. And this bipolarity had to be overcome. And that already began with TRADOC as well. Then, under Reagan, the US president at the time, it really became visible. Yes, the president. He then issued all the security doctrines. There were 3 or 4 of them that actually went to the core of the Soviet Union.
And this concept was recalibrated during the collapse of the Soviet Union and reoriented under Paul Wolfowitz, who was responsible for these issues at the time.
Thanks for pointing that out. So, we remember, they were successful there. The Soviet Union was collapsing. It was simply economically overextended. It was finished. And then, on September 11th, 1990, George Herbert Bush, the president at the time, gave an address to the nation. In that speech, he called toward a new world order. In other words, onward to a unipolar world order. That was the fanfare on September 11th, 1990.
Am 11. September 1990.
And Wolfowitz's thinking was aimed at ensuring that the Americans would remain the only dominant power in a unipolar world and tolerate no competitor alongside them.
And Wolfowitz became Deputy Secretary of Defense on September 11 toward a new world order. And in January, the Soviet Union ended on December 31st. The war against Iraq had already begun. It was a war that Kohl stayed out of. But I think every German had to pay 1,000 marks per capita. We simply bought our way out through non-participation. And of course, the Americans made sure that.
And we can still see that today. We bought ourselves the option of not taking part.
Yes, he paid. He said the Bundeswehr couldn't do it. We couldn't take part in this coalition of the willing. And above all, he said the basic law didn't allow it either, and the public was not prepared for it. He was certainly able to justify that. Kohl had rightly stayed out of the first Gulf War. And then this is what happened. After that first Gulf War, when Germany only paid, and paid a lot, as far as I remember, 1,000 marks per person. And for a country of 78 million people at the time, that added up to quite a lot, let me put it that way. And then something else had to be done. The Bundeswehr, that too had not been permitted at all. During my officer training, deployments abroad would simply have been unimaginable. Unimaginable.
Has that changed? Yes, at the latest with the war against Serbia, which was also a violation of international law.
Then came Somalia. In 1993, right after that war, they came up with the idea. The German Bundeswehr would now go to Somalia, into this war, because there was a war in Somalia too. But it would not take part in any fighting. Instead, it would build wells there and supply the Indian Brigade with food, sanitation, and so on. Of course, those were measures that every citizen in this country could support. And then they sent this Bundeswehr contingent to Somalia. It was guarded by the Italians, mind you. They were not even allowed to guard themselves. They then tried to build wells, but that was a flop as well. That was never really the point. The point was simply to show the Bundeswehr is now in Somalia too. And it made it plainly visible to everyone that this was, to a certain extent, a fake, because the Indian brigade that was supposed to be supplied never even arrived.
But from the American perspective, it was also about gradually drawing Germany into proxy wars.
Exactly, that was the only measure. For me, that was clear from the very beginning. And of course, that was when the Bundeswehr gradually started slipping into all these missions around the world, all the way to Afghanistan, everywhere. And I really can't understand that.
And the next step was in fact the bombing of Serbia. German tornadoes reportedly flew reconnaissance missions meaning to identify targets, but they were also fired upon.
Maßnahmen getroffen haben, aber sie wurden auch beschossen.
Well, the losses from the NATO bombing over those 78 days and nights were relatively low, and the German military or the German Air Force took part in it. And it is irrelevant whether an aircraft is flying reconnaissance missions or dropping bombs. Both are participants in the war. You cannot say that one person presses the button to drop a bomb while the other only presses the button to take a picture, to identify targets so they can be bombed more effectively afterward. That is what it is about, after all, making it possible to bomb targets even more effectively. So that is part of warfare.
You can't distinguish between them. The Chancellor at the time, Gerhard Schroeder, later said, "It was certainly a war that violated international law, but I stand by it."
What do you make of that? Well, the public prosecutor really should have stepped in. And Admiral Schmeling did do that. He filed criminal complaints against all the members of the government who shared responsibility for it, specifically for violating Article 26, I believe it is, Article 26, which makes a war of aggression punishable, and so on. And in this case, there was clearly participation in a war of aggression, however you want to put it. Then the federal prosecutor general dismissed the charges and said, no, the representatives of the federal government did not commit a criminal offense. And now comes the twist. The basic law makes the preparation of a war of aggression punishable, but they did not take part in the preparation. They only took part in carrying it out, and that is not punishable.
Well, the public prosecutor's office, the federal prosecutor general, is an authority bound by instructions.
Yeah, what a joke. What a joke. I mean, if planning it is already punishable, then of course participating in carrying it out is as well. No, step by step, they stumbled into becoming a party to this war. And when I think about it, this war ended after 78 days. It never turned into a ground war, because Milosevic, the president at the time, got what he had wanted from the very beginning. In Rambouillet, he signed everything the West had put forward regarding autonomy for Kosovo. He signed everything, and they were supposed to double-cross him. And they did double-cross him, thanks to Joschka Fischer, the foreign minister, together with Madame Albright. They then added an appendix, Annex B, which called on Yugoslavia to hand over the entire country to NATO by water, by air, and by land.
And that would basically have been an unconditional surrender.
Yes, and he did not sign it.
Because he couldn't sign it.
And I read Oscar Lafontaine's book, My Heart Beats on the Left. In it, the finance minister at the time clearly described what happened in the cabinet. The foreign minister stated that he did not know the treaty, he did not make any distinction, that we knew nothing at all about the annex. So we went into this war on the basis of a lie. And I think that is an original sin that, for me, is simply incomprehensible. Above all, it was never properly dealt with afterward.
It began with a lie, and it continued with lies. After September 11th, the Americans attacked Afghanistan. Now the German military is supposed to come and drill wells.
Ja, genau. Also Afghanistan, der Angriff auf Afghanistan,
Yes,
das war General
exactly.
Wesley
The
Clark.
attack on
Der hat ja
Afghanistan,
dann
that was
erfahren,
General Wesley
im
Clark. He
Pentagon
later
einen
learned about it
Befehl
at the
untergebenen,
Pentagon from a
der
former
oberhalb von
subordinate who
Rumsfeld
was
saß
working
dann.
under
Ja, und
Rumsfeld.
der hat ihm
And
gezeigt,
that person
was
showed
hier
him what was
geplant ist.
being
Es war innerhalb
planned.
der ersten 14 Tage,
Within the
dass
first
7 Länder
14 days,
angegriffen werden
7
sollen.
countries were
Das
supposed to
hat
be
er also um
attacked.
Gottes Willen.
And he
Er
said,
hat
My
dann also
God.
7 Jahre
General Wesley
2007 hat er
Clark
das
made this
publik
public
gemacht,
in
der General Wesley
2007.
Clark.
And it
Und,
really is
und das ist
outrageous.
ja
But Afghanistan
wirklich
wasn't even on the
ungeheuerlich.
list.
Und
What other countries
Afghanistan
were
war
being
aber gar nicht
considered
auf
at the
der Liste
time?
drauf.
Welche
Iran was
Länder
on
haben
it
denn noch
too.
in Frage? Danke.
Afghanistan was the only one that
Die Iran
wasn't.
war auch drauf. Der
But then we
einzige
have
ist ja momentan
Syria,
dann da
Libya,
Syrien,
Somalia, Sudan, and
Libyen,
so on.
denke ich, Somalia, Sudan und so weiter. Also das, wo überall es jetzt auch überall brennt, nicht?
So those are the
Ja, auch
places
Länder,
where
in
things are
denen
now
es
burning everywhere.
natürliche Ressourcen gibt.
Mostly,
Das
they're also
und
countries
Länder,
with
die alle
natural
im Umfeld,
resources.
im
That's one
Einflussbereich
thing.
vom
And they're countries that all lie in the area,
US-Zentralkommando
in the
liegen.
sphere of
Also die
influence
USA haben
of
die
U.S.
Welt
Central Command.
komplett mit 6
The United
Regionalkommandos
States has
überspannt.
essentially spanned the
Und das
entire world
zentrale
with 6
US-Kommando,
regional
das
commands.
zentrale,
And U.S.
die
Central Command,
sitzen
CENTCOM,
also
is
von
located there from
Ägypten
Egypt to
bis nach
Kazakhstan.
Kasachstan. Also
More or
viele
less the
Länder,
countries
mehr oder
below the
weniger.
heartland.
Also
The
unterhalb
heartland
von
defined by
dem
Mackinder
Verzeichnis vom
in 1904,
definierten
where he
Estland
said,
von
whoever
1904
conquers this
und
heartland
sagt,
also
dieses
owns
Herzland,
Eurasia.
wer das
And whoever
erobert,
owns
der,
Eurasia
dem
owns the
gehört dann
world.
auch Eurasien. Und wem Eurasien gehört, gehört die Welt.
Halford Mackinder,
Halford Mackinder, ja.
ein britischer Geograph,
Halford Mackinder, a British geographer, gave a lecture before the Royal Geographical Society in 1904. In it, he explained, if the sea powers want to retain control, global dominance, they must dominate Eurasia. And you do that by dividing it.
Raum beherrschen, und das macht man, indem man ihn spaltet.
Genau, genau. Und seit wir das haben, wie
Exactly,
gesagt, sie haben ja
exactly.
dann auch
And since then, as I said, they also took over the island of Diego Garcia. The population there in the Indian Ocean was simply evacuated, without being asked. They took their case to the International Court of Justice, and they won, with the stipulation that as soon as this island is no longer relevant to U.S. policy, they may return.
Politik, dann dürfen sie wieder zurück.
Zurück zu diesem
Back to this 7-country concept. Are the United States still implementing it today? Is there a long-term strategy?
Strategie?
Ja, sie setzen das komplett um und
Yes, they are implementing it completely. And these countries, this is connected to the paper they adopted in 2014. Under Wolfowitz, there was this training concept called 525-5. It was about full-spectrum armies at the beginning of the 21st century. Full spectrum. What does that mean? It means armed forces that can be deployed anywhere in the world, anywhere. Full spectrum. Anywhere.
Überall. Volldimensionale. Überall. Zu
Also
Land, zu
dieses
Luft.
Konzept
So this concept describes how the United States can fight several wars at the same time, at arm's length. That was what they initially planned, yes. And that was this concept of
Das war also dieses Konzept von 1994 von Wolfowitz.
In 1994 by Wolfowitz. So the goal was, and this is also the Wolfowitz doctrine, a unipolar world order led by the United States. And at the beginning of the 21st century, that required one full-spectrum military force that could strike anywhere, including in different places at the same time. And that military is already in place. We are at the beginning of the 21st century, and they had reached that point. You simply have to acknowledge it without envy. Despite some setbacks, they were very successful overall.
Manche Rückschläge, doch insgesamt sehr erfolgreich. Sie setzen ihr Konzept.
they are implementing their plan, and that would make an attack on Iran possible. An attack on the last country still on the list.
Ja, einmal das, aber
Yes, that's one thing. But Iran has also been put on a new list, so it's on several lists. Then, as I said, there was also the color revolution to put that into effect.
Um das umzusetzen. Und in diesem Papier
So color revolutions, which were used primarily in Eastern Europe, that too. Yes.
Ja, ja, und dieses Papier von 1994 hat ja
And this 1994 paper has two very important core sections. One is operations, that's his term, meaning operations other than war. And it shows that for the armed forces, peace-building measures can be used externally as a direct lever to actually get into a war, either a regional or limited war or a world war.
Regionalen oder limitierten Krieg oder den Weltkrieg.
How does that work? That's what I often hear from people I'm in contact with.
Ja, dass da, um friedensbildende Maßnahmen irgendwie zu machen, dass da Kräfte in das Land kommen, mehr oder weniger, die dann subversiv tätig sind und die Kontakte zu dem Widerstand aufnehmen und das und so weiter. Da fließen dann schon mal die Gelder und wie auch immer. Der kann also, dass dieses Land in diesen
This
Krieg
country can be
geführt
drawn
werden
into
kann
this
über
war
diese
through these
Kräfte.
forces.
Dann haben wir
Then we talked about weapons reduction measures, about weapons being collected in the country. And while the weapons are being collected, this is of course already happening as well.
auch schon gemacht. Dann
Also
das
zunächst entwaffnen.
So first, disarm them, then strengthen the internal opposition, destabilize a government that way, increase the pressure from outside, and then bring about a pro-American regime change.
Amerikanischen Regimewechsel
entwaffnen dann natürlich
herbeiführen.
die Kräfte, vor denen man sich fürchtet.
Disarm the forces people fear in that country, of course. They have to be disarmed. Then the weapons go to the others, more or less. So it's a whole package. Disaster relief is part of it too. It applies wherever they can bring their subversive forces into the country. That's the goal. Those are the operations, PSYOPs, and the American military is very proud to note that they have succeeded in doing this quite often. And it's about control over resources and geostrategic control.
Herrschaft und geostrategische Kontrolle.
Es geht um die Weltherrschaft, es geht um die
It's about world domination. It's about the unipolar world order. What can we learn about modern warfare from the war against Iran carried out in violation of international law by Washington and Tel Aviv?
Über moderne Kriegsführung.
Der Weg, die Völker, die Länder
The approach of breaking up countries, including Iran, that's what he tried to do, and that's what he'll try to do now as well. So there's a common thread running through it. This doctrine, which was ended in 2014, the one from 1994, which ran for 24 years, over 2 decades, that has largely been completed. But another core point, and this is the important one, is this. They have the transition of the world. They have 2 decades of transitioning the world from 1994 to 2014 through unrest and war. That is the transition. And this transition proceeds in stages. It is laid out. The first stage is unrest, conflict, crisis, conflict.
Krise, Konflikt. Das zu machen, braucht man diese Operations other than war.
To do that, you need these operations other than war. It all goes together. A directive, a guide for the U.S. Army from 1994. You can read it all. And I have to say, they have succeeded very well at it. Except for Iran, where they are still trying now. So far, it has been able to evade it. In other words, it is a concept of exerting influence to destabilize in order to establish hegemony, so to speak. It is about the unipolar world order. This is the Wolfowitz doctrine that is to be implemented. And that is the struggle the world is in now. The world has been in this struggle ever since, a unipolar world versus a multipolar world.
Unipolare Welt gegen multipolare Welt. Und unipolare Welt, das ist natürlich
And a unipolar world, of course, means the Golden West, the Golden Billion.
wo ich sagen muss,
And I have to say, you should be ashamed to say something like that, because the rest of the world immediately responds, why are you the Golden Billion? Because you took all of this from us. You took it all away from us, more or less, over the past centuries. And I think this multipolar world order, especially from the global south, these are the countries that suffered so terribly under British colonialism for more than 400 years, or under the U.S. wars of the past 100 years, that we will not allow a unipolar world order.
Wir werden eine unipolare Weltordnung nicht zulassen.
Nun hat ja auf der Münchner Sicherheitskonferenz im
Now, at the Munich Security Conference in February 2026, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said, yes, things went well for 500 years. After 1945, things got somewhat out of hand with the unipolar world. Donald Trump is reversing that, and we have to move toward a kind of neo-imperial, neo-colonial concept. We're happy to do that with the Europeans, but if necessary, we'll do it alone.
Mit den Europäern, aber zur Not machen wir es auch alleine.
Ja, also ich denke, das war ehrlich.
Yes, I think that was honest.
Sie werden das
You simply have to acknowledge that. They will carry it out, including under Trump. It's about make America great again. What they're doing now are strategic games, on the one hand to distract, but the goal is completely clear, in my view. It's about the unipolar world order. And it's about the United States, which is actually more or less economically bankrupt. What we saw was that the pipeline was blown up, And then Biden said, German industry, you can no longer produce cost-effectively in Germany, but come to us. We have subsidies, you'll get locations, we'll help you. Of course, because the United States also has to build up its economy, it has to make it competitive again. And naturally, it's nice when German companies come over and take that on. You could say, the hegemon.
Kann man sagen, der Hegemon, Washington.
In times of crisis, Washington increases the tribute it demands from its vassals.
Absolutely. It really is about this confrontation. And then in Stratfor's follow-up paper in 2014, 6 months after Maidan, in September 2014, it was described as a Western-orchestrated coup in Ukraine. Exactly. Clearly. And Madame Nuland said, after all, that we invested a total of $5 billion in Ukraine, and now we want to reap the benefits, which, so far, is working. It is working. The money is coming from somewhere else, from Europe. It is, so to speak, being vacuumed out of Europe, and of course substantially out of Germany as well. Then it flows back through Kiev into their pockets. Surely.
With the side effect that 2 million people have already lost their lives.
Yes, I mean, the people who do something like that are so utterly contemptuous of human beings. They simply don't care at all.
Just once more on the war against Iran. According to your theory, this is apparently a proxy war. What can we learn from this war?
The entire war has a cloak over it. It has a roof, and that roof was built half a year after the Maidan, in September 2014, with this new TRADOC regulation. TRADOC 525-31, that is. And its title is Win in a Complex World 2020 to 2040.
And what does it say? How do they plan to implement it?
Yes, that is what they intend to do. With their full-scale armies at the beginning of the 20th century, they believed they could do this all at once. Now they realize that it does not work that way, because the adversary, Russia, as well as China and Iran, has become significantly stronger than when all these intentions were planned. And it says so there, under Section 2.4, under the heading New Conflicts or Future Conflicts. It says Future Conflicts. It states that the armed forces, the Army, Air Force, Navy, All-Domain Command, Cyber Command, must prepare during these 2 decades from 2020 to 2040, so there are still 16 years left to reduce the threat posed by Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. That is it.
Der Enthauptungsschlag ging ja.
The decapitation strike failed, despite the killing of Iran's leader, Ali Khamenei. Does this strategy work?
Ja.
Geht dieses Konzept auf?
Das geht natürlich nicht auf. Wenn da die
Of course, that doesn't add up. If they kill the old military figures, the old gray-haired generals who are over 60, well, maybe that has a short-term effect. No, I don't even think so. Then you have the younger generals behind them, maybe not even 50 yet. They have a completely different kind of drive, and they will be so angry that they will respond very differently. So I think this achieves exactly the opposite. Maybe that was the intention. Maybe they wanted to provoke them to the utmost so that they would simply strike back, unwaveringly, without reflection. But they don't do that. As far as I can judge, they act very deliberately, in some cases asymmetrically, and so on. They don't allow themselves to be provoked.
The Iranian professor Marandi, whom I respect very highly, said that the war against Iran is an asymmetrical war calibrated in terms of timing, as he puts it. In other words, what happens has all been planned out.
Es ist durchgeplant, was zeitlich hintereinander geschieht von Seiten Teherans.
Is happening one after another on Tehran's side. Yes, on their side. But whether that's a good thing now, of course, they also have to. There are 2 players or 3 players. We have to see, what are the Americans doing and what are the Israelis doing? There are, of course, different scenarios in play. Let's just take the economic situation. If the Strait of Hormuz is closed now, it isn't completely closed as such. It's passable for friends, it's only closed to enemies. And the United States wants to force a breakthrough. And Trump is angry that the Western allies aren't supporting that in the way he wants, however that may be. There are a lot of smoke screens being thrown up here. It could also be that this conflict, like the conflict in Ukraine, keeps simmering along for a long time. We have a time frame through 2040. And of course, we also have to see that while we have these papers, these strategy papers, there is naturally a struggle within the staffs over which path to take. Do we do it this way? The situation has changed, and that's where the first thing happened. It has now been a year and 4 months since people said, we can't do it the same way anymore. That realization is already there. We have to sequence it. And sequencing it means that Europe, of course, is now supposed to keep Russia tied down in the war. Russia has to continue to be worn down. And then another theater of war can be used.
So the Europeans are supposed to keep Russia tied down by Europeanizing the war in Ukraine. Then the Americans have their hands free for other conflicts.
That's why I also see what's going on here as theater. Europe is preparing itself. And in principle, we are now where England and France are also headed. First, they were together with Russia against Germany, and now together with Germany against Russia. So that is also a backdrop to this entire conflict. The perspective of the British Starmer, for example. In the end, there are so many interests at play here that are not being looked at all. But the only one who really understands nothing, who understood nothing in 2014 and understands nothing now, is the German Michel.
In Iran,
the leadership in Tehran sees it this way. The Americans want to bomb us into submission. We respond by using Chinese assistance and Chinese satellite data to target American military bases. But we also attack gas and oil production facilities. We attack helium production facilities. And we close the Strait of Hormuz to strike at the core of the Western economy, with effects reaching all the way to the stock market. Then, as a further step, we help the Houthis shut down the Red Sea, and with it the Suez Canal. That way, with minimal means, we can paralyze large parts of global trade and drive the world economy into a crisis.
The concept is good. It really is good. But it has one very small catch. It's genuinely good. But there's another player involved. I have to look at this. What is the other player doing? And I think what happened was that the global economy was disrupted in such a way that everything comes to a standstill, that China is hit, that Europe here is hit anyway, and that the US is hit in part, only in part. They still have resources. They won't necessarily be hit completely, only partially. The US has its own gas. Europe does not. And that could be the trick, that the Americans, or other forces, we always have to keep in mind that different forces are involved in these decisions about which path to take, and that this can also change. It's not uniform. But this idea of letting the Iranians do it, or maybe they've figured it out by now, I don't know. Great concept. They hit something, they succeed, they destroy all of it. The world now has to do without Iranian oil. What are the consequences? Of course, that has massive consequences for many others. And then, that could be the idea among some American planners, military planners, or politicians who say, if the others are brought to their knees like that, then we can tell them, you'll get oil from us. But you have to be on our side in the war. You have to wage war against Iran. So certain circles can be used as leverage.
When the empire comes under pressure from outside, it tightens the reins on its satrapies. You could put it that way.
And above all, Iran would also be helping, through these measures, to make it possible to actually force them to fight against Iran. alongside the United
USA
States.
an der Seite gegen den Iran zu kämpfen.
Nun gibt es ja eine fundamentale
Now,
Veränderung.
there has been a fundamental change in modern warfare. In the past, massive tank formations would move in. Today, there are drones because the battlefield is under complete surveillance and they disrupt any concentration of forces. In the past, there were massive air operations by fleets of bombers and fighter bombers. Today, hypersonic missiles handle that, and they can hit any fighter jet as well. In the past, aircraft carriers operated around the world. Today, as we have seen, those carriers can be put out of action for weeks with cheap drones.
Ja.
Wochenlang außer Gefecht gesetzt werden.
ja.
Was hat sich da verändert?
Ja, es hat sich
What has changed? The entire way war is waged has changed. It has shifted away from hard power to soft power. And that brings us to the subject of omnivore. How can I describe omnivore? It is warfare spanning from the human cell all the way to the stratosphere.
menschliche Zelle bis zur Stratosphäre.
Das müssen
You'll have to explain that to me.
Also, man greift in die menschliche Zelle ein, um den Menschen durch
They are intervening in the human cell in order to completely alter human beings through transhumanism and everything that can be done in that area so that they become the invulnerable fighter on the battlefield. How do they do that? For example, by intervening in brain-machine interfaces. In some cases, you don't even need that. You can already be far enough along to influence them that way, in terms of how they feel, your own soldiers as well as enemy soldiers, and so on. So it goes very deep. And Professor Hughes described this starting in 2020 as omnivore, meaning he was the first to coin the term. And he said that the beginning, that is 2019, was when capitalism, with its surveillance state system, had failed.
mit seinem Überwachungsstaatssystem gescheitert. Und deshalb kam dann 2020 auch
And that is why in 2020, the pandemic came as a preliminary stage leading into this Third World War. The mobilization of fear. Exactly, that is the fear. And that is what it is about. This is also part of this omnivore, putting people in fear. Fear as a permanent state. Exactly. And with this omnivore, it is simply about transhumanism, cognitive warfare, and so on. And the omnivore is then directed against human beings. Ultimately, it is about enslaving people. The new war that is being waged is no longer fought with tank armies or anything like that. It is directed against these people, exclusively against these people.
Gegen diese Menschen. Ausschließlich gegen diese Menschen.
George Orwell hat in
George Orwell wrote in his dystopian novel 1984 that modern war is not directed against an external enemy. Its purpose is to maintain the balance of power at home.
Herrschaftsverhältnisse im Innern aufrechtzuerhalten.
Genau. Und das ist, was hier läuft. Und jetzt wird's
Exactly,
wirklich interessant.
exactly. And that is what is happening here. And now it gets really interesting, and I'm still surprised by this. In October of last year, this Training and Doctrine Command was transferred into a new command. The parallels to 73 are obvious. The United States is now in the process of losing the war in Ukraine, its proxy war, similar to Vietnam back then. And in the United States, we no longer have demonstrations like we did in 1973. Instead, the United States may be heading toward a civil war.
Die USA strebt eventuell einen Bürgerkrieg zu. Also da braucht man jetzt ganz andere Hämmer, ganz was anderes. Und das
So
ist
now
das
you need
neue
completely
Kommando.
different hammers,
Das ist
something
überschrieben.
entirely different.
Und da wird eigentlich alles
And that is
ganz
this
deutlich.
new
Es ist-
command now.
es ist
That's what
echt
it's called.
offensichtlich. Das heißt,
And
die
honestly,
US
that makes everything
Army
clear. It's obvious, really. It's now called the U.S. Army Transformation and Training Command.
Training.
So, transformation.
Also das
And it's about the transformation of human beings. And it includes everything the Pentagon has been doing since 1980. Transhumanism, human body interfaces, and the entire program.
Stellen und hier das gesamte Programm
Wie sehen denn
What do these human-machine interfaces actually look like?
Schnittstellen aus? Das müssen Sie mir erklären.
Ja, da stehe ich auch nicht so drin.
You'll have to explain that to me.
Ich,
I'm not deeply familiar with it either,
das
Mr.
sind
Bob.
wissenschaftliche Entwicklungen.
These are
Das
scientific
heißt, es so,
developments. The situation is this. Work is being done on it all over the world, in such a way that the individual areas don't know what the others are doing. So in the end, only T2 Command knows what all of it adds up to. They know because they have the global overview of everything they're having researched, and so on. And I'm convinced it's really about the absolute control of human beings. And not just the formation of will. It's actually about perception and the formation of will. T2 Command wants to control all of that. The individual's perception, what they're allowed to perceive, what they may and should do, and how they can be controlled.
NATO's concept of cognitive warfare states, we do not want to change the content of people's thinking, but the structure of their thinking.
Yes, that too. But cognitive warfare is a subcategory. It's already outdated. It's long been superseded by omnivore. Things have already moved a step further. Of course, parts of it will still be retained. That's perfectly clear, especially until the other system is fully operational. But the command alone, T2 Command, Transformation and Training Command, it's so obvious what's being planned here. And when you look closely at that, I have to say, I always try to keep track of what's going on there. Very little is written about it.
Because people don't understand it. What areas does omnivore cover?
Omnivore umfasst alle Bereiche.
Omnivore covers every area. Omnivore, that is Omnivore's chain of strategy. It really ranges from transhumanism, from changing human beings, giving people special abilities, or not, or the opposite. So it includes everything that is being done here. We have already talked about cognitive warfare, and then of course intervention in the human being, in what is original, right down to the cell, changing the cell. They stop at nothing, absolutely nothing. The central battlefield, and you can read this in NATO documents as well, is the human brain. Exactly. And now they have created a command, replacing the old one from 1973 with a new one, the fully modern one. But this war, the old document, still remains in force.
Das alte Papier besteht weiter. Also dieses Papier Win in a Complex World.
So this paper, Win in a Complex World 2020 to 2014, is being modified. It has to be adjusted because the planning from 2014 is somewhat outdated. Russia has developed very differently, and China certainly has as well. And I have to say, last September I spent 2 weeks traveling around China. I wanted to get an impression for myself, the way I did in Siberia in 1977. And I have to say, I simply could not stop being amazed. The technical innovations, the technical expertise. As an engineer myself, I have to say, we have completely lost touch. And when a country has developed its infrastructure the way China has today, then I make the leap and say, I think they will have that in the military sphere as well.
That means the West is using military means to fight its own decline.
Yes, exactly. For me, it's completely clear. The impression I had of China now, compared with Russia in 1977, is 180 degrees different. Completely different. We have, after all,
177, 180 Grad, komplett anders.
Nun haben ja jüngst 7 Millionen Amerikaner.
Just recently, 7 million Americans demonstrated against Israel's and the United States' attack on Iran. Nothing in Germany.
In Deutschland nichts. Kannst du mir das erklären?
Can you explain that to me? We can do that. That is our history. That is our culture of remembrance. There isn't much to explain there. So it's lasting. And above all, because it is immediately sanctioned as well. I sometimes have to ask myself, why do I write about it when I think I'm being very careful, but I don't address it directly because I know I'll just get beaten up for it. It's not about facts. It's not about the issues. I've been to Israel too. I was friends with Rolf Verleger, an advocate of peace and reconciliation. I visited him in Jerusalem, and I was also with him in his peace village, Neve Shalom. Well, I was there, and he was with me. We worked together here. And on his last visit with me, shortly before his death, he told me that at age 17, after the Second World War, he went from Romania to Israel. And there, he cried. He is truly a devout Jew. A devout Jew, yes. A person of peace. A person of peace and reconciliation, you simply have to say. And he said that the violence coming from Israel here cannot be reconciled with the Talmud and the Torah. It cannot be reconciled, and he said that if they do not stop soon, he fears that one day Israel will no longer exist. And then he cried.
Israel irgendwann nicht mehr geben wird.
Das
Und hat dann
Empire,
geweint. Und da hat er geweint.
das Empire der Vereinigten Staaten, das
The United States empire, the imperial power, is also an empire of chaos. It creates chaos in other countries in order to maintain its system of domination.
Danke für den Hinweis, lieber Herr Bab, weil ganz wichtiger Hinweis, gerade die Neokonservativen.
A very important point. The neoconservatives, specifically, had those documents from 1996 and 1997, A New American Century. Trump is building on that with MAGA and Make America Great Again, and their philosopher had already laid this out for them. The philosopher of the neoconservatives was Leo Strauss, and Leo Strauss drilled it into them, saying, "You have to wage war all over the world, but never end the wars."
Aber die Kriege nie beenden. Und nach dem Kriegsvölkerrecht ist ja so, wenn ich gegen ein anderes Land Krieg
And under the laws of war, it's like this. If I wage war against another country, then as the belligerent who has won, I'm immediately obligated to restore order there, to make sure people don't have to suffer any further, and so on. That's what the rules require. But they don't do that. They bomb it back, and they also stand by while the rival fighting keeps spreading, more or less. Maybe they even steer it. And he says, you have to create chaos all over the world, and then turn it into creative chaos for yourselves.
Daraus für euch ein kreatives Chaos machen.
Angesichts eines
Given a chaotic world, a world entering a new century of wars, what would you advise people in Germany as a military historian? I can offer only one piece of advice.
Ich kann nur eins raten. Also, ich bin da wirklich nicht als Pazifist aufgewachsen.
Well, I certainly didn't grow up as a pacifist. I was 16 during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. I was always politically minded, even as a young man back in school, and I followed it closely. Of course, I feared that it would lead to nuclear war, because the fear of nuclear war was palpable everywhere in 1962. That shaped me too. And the American nuclear bomber fleet was already in the air, headed toward the Soviet Union. It was already airborne. Robert Kennedy later described what he had to do to bring it back, while his brother, John F. Kennedy, was talking with Khrushchev. He was on the phone with him, trying to get the bomber fleet called back. So in my view, it really hung by a thread.
Also, es war wirklich am seidenen Faden. Mein Eindruck.
What do these experiences mean for people in Germany today?
Ja, die sollten eigentlich präsent sein.
They should really be present. They should be present everywhere. But what's happening here now is exactly the opposite. Are the Germans sleepwalking into decline? No, they're not sleepwalking into decline. They're in a deep coma. You can't wake them up.
Die kann man nicht wecken. Im Schlaf könnte ich einen Wecker stellen, oder?
I could set an alarm in my sleep, right? Germans are in a deep coma in a world heading toward an all-encompassing omni-war. And that is dangerous, says military historian Wolfgang Effenberger. And we will show you positions and perspectives that the propaganda media are keeping quiet about. Stay tuned.
Medien verschweigen. Bleiben Sie dran.